Hello and welcome to Bups's Dharma Lounge. This is a place and a time to relax and share all things Dharma. Welcome. Hi, I'm Bupsa Frank Jude, and I want to welcome you to this special episode of the Dharma Lounge. Well, I'll have the pleasure to join in conversation with Daniel Simpson. Say what you will about social media, but this is, again, one of the contacts that I've made through social media. Daniel and I became Facebook friends after our independent appearances on Scott Johnson's Still Points podcast, where we both saw that we had a lot that we resonated around. So we reached out, we friended each other. And then recently, Daniel invited me onto his podcast, Ancient Futures. And so today it's my turn to host him here at Bups's Dharma Lounge. But first, again, I wish to thank all of you for your support. If you find the Dharma Lounge helpful, please consider subscribing. Don't consider it, just hit that button, do it, all right? That's one of the best ways you can support the podcast. Other ways are sharing it, rating it where possible. If you're listening to this on Apple, for instance, if you want to share it with friends, and if you would like to offer dana, which is just sharing, to make this podcast feasible and doable, anything at all is gratefully appreciated. And in light of that, I would like to take time to publicly thank some of the people who offered dana since the last episode. Jiu Ted Robbins, Chatra Sandy Greenberg, Hyokin Tatiana Staloff, and Bernie Perus. And I saved Bernie for last because it's really interesting. Bernie, thank you very much. Bernie took my Commit to Sit course in January. It started in January of 2018. And he had attempted to start a meditation course many times throughout his life. And so far, so good. It really stuck. He's been sitting every day since he started that course in January 2018. All right, so as I said, Daniel Simpson will be joining me, and he presents what he refers to as ancient texts for modern times. He's the author of The Truth of Yoga, this wonderful book, thin and yet packed full of wonderful, accessible information. It's a comprehensive guide to the very history of practice. His approach combines scholarly knowledge with humor and insight, making yoga philosophy accessible and relevant to practitioners today. And the relevancy is really where I think the importance lies. He teaches courses online at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies and through yoga teacher trainings around the UK and internationally. In fact, only recently I found out that he's been a guest teacher for one of my colleague here in Tucson's yoga teacher training. So he gets around thanks to social media and technology, huh? He also offers workshops and private tutoring. Drawing on a master's degree from SOAS, the University of London, and 2 decades of experience, his aim is to help students explore their own path. He supplements his teaching with work as an editor. So I really look forward to the conversation with Daniel Simpson. So here we are. Welcome, Daniel. It's really good to see you again.
Oh, lovely to be chatting again, Frank Jude. I had such a nice conversation with you last time. I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, really. Especially since then, I've read your book, and I wrote a raved Goodreads review, and one of the first things,
and gave it a big red heart.
Yeah. And one of the first things I wrote was like, in from my filter, as you can see, the Swans T-shirt and all that,
Mm.
a very punk rock move to call a book "The Truth of Yoga," um, and then on the very first page, talk about how there's no single truth, right? And that's really the
Yeah.
thing that I think is really important for a lot of people to understand, because um, there has there is a real sense, I think, amongst many people who don't go deep enough into it, that there's
Mm.
this one thing, yoga.
We've all been told that, I think, by teachers at some point. And, to pick one luminary who's certainly got a much fatter book than mine out there. He's no longer with us, Georg Feurstein. He called his sort of magnum opus the yoga tradition, as if there was only one, and tried to date it all the way back to, more than 5,000 years ago.
Yeah,
And we've heard this story that everything's sort of timelessly unfolding, and often as well combined with some sort of concept of it all just being right here, right now, and that's the only message there's ever been, and it's just been perhaps added to and unpacked and a little bit more complexity over the centuries. But
yeah.
there are so many different ways of addressing what yoga might be for, where it
Hmm.
might lead, what tools you need to enlist in the process, how you might live. And they've got completely conflicting philosophical
Yeah.
explanations. So some scholars would even argue you can't call anything yoga because all the definitions cancel each other out. But I think
Yeah.
that's maybe one step too far.
Well, it's interesting though, because I think probably Georg should have just called it the yoga traditions or something, but I think he was trying to get
Yeah,
at, like, because he in that book obviously he talks about Hindu yoga, Buddhist yoga, Jaina yoga, right?
of
And I
course.
still meet people who's like, wait, Buddhism's yoga? It's like, of course, the Noble Eightfold Path is a yogic path, right? And what Georg was trying to get across was that there's this concept of yoga, and then it's evolved into three major, what he would call cultures. He didn't even think of them as religions, yogic
Mm,
cultures. But then within each one of those, there's like a stream of variety. And I think at one point, he came up with something that I thought was actually a bit of a useful tool, because he was like, if we can talk about some yogis who are, if not atheistic, certainly non-theistic. And then
mhm.
you've got some yogis who are like bhakti, devotion to deities. What do they have in common? And try
Mm.
to tease that out. And the first of the 10 principles he came up with actually was that they all have a soteriological purpose. They're moksha, freedom. But then that is
Yeah.
described differently in all the different traditions.
Well, exactly. That's it. And it becomes very difficult to actually identify the common ground. I think perhaps the easiest way is to rewind as far as we can. I mean, we don't really know where yoga started or when. We can only, have an educated guess. But there is this common thread connecting those, three major ancient Indic, traditions that have become in some ways religions, the Buddhist and Hindu and Jain traditions, all of which have a yogic, dimension to them. And in some cases, in particularly the Hindu one, that seems to have emerged pretty much on the fringes of what everybody would rather talk about, which is, the Vedic tradition. And the whole idea of renouncing really is something that connects all of these traditions, at least in their origin. Turning your back on the conventional wisdom of what what we take for granted as life, and
Mm,
how we operate in life, and how we relate to action, and how we relate to the mental engagement in action, the investment of some kind of expectation of an outcome, and all of that stuff seems to be held in common, this questioning of action. And from that point, different paths have developed and been turned inside out. But at the same time, they do come from that common thread. And so I think in that sense, Georg was right. He was trying to go back to what people would now talk about as the Shramana movements, these early renouncer traditions who
mm,
shared so many ideas that it's very hard to differentiate them. We can only really do that in hindsight from what they've become.
mm.
Originally, they seem to just be engaged in a very similar project.
Yeah, yeah, like that philosophical schools or darshanas like Vedanta and classical yoga are
Mm.
both, like, the roots are both found in the Upanishads. So like you've got this incredible diversity in there, and some people pick one aspect, and
Mhm.
it's like the same in Buddhism, where there are whole Buddhist sects where they just base it on one book or a group of books, and it's like, well, there's like a library of books.
Well, exactly. The religion of the book is the thing that a lot of people in the West have turned away from to
Mm,
get interested in Eastern traditions, and
mm,
it's one of the reasons I, to blow my own horn and go back to that passage you were talking about there being, no one true yoga. And also say, because of that, you have to study these different traditions in their own context, and
mm.
they've all got their own texts and they've all got their own ideas, and they all make sense on their own terms. But that doesn't mean we're obliged to pick one of them and uncritically follow whatever it says, because we
Exactly.
live here and now. We've got
Mm.
to relate what they tell us to how we live, and
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, therefore
I,
these texts are source materials. They're inspiration. So
yeah.
long as we don't pretend that then what we make of them is actually what the texts themselves say, otherwise we get completely lost.
Yeah, for me, it was always, I'm just that 10 years younger. So, like, I was more punk rock than hippie, right?
Mm,
But a lot of the teachers and people are friends with, I started practicing in the 70s, so it was still very much the 60s hippie kind of thing. And
yeah.
um, it was all about, this ironically, people who were rejecting authority here, but then they
Mm,
turned to these Eastern religions and completely abdicated all personal accountability and responsibility in many ways. I remember actually in a training with Georg, the only
mm,
teacher training he ever did in 2002, and we spent almost 200 hours just on the Yoga Sutra. And the people
wow.
in the training were already, quote, certified yoga teachers.
Mm.
And they were blown away to find out that so much of what Patanjali said they did not agree with, right? He was a world renouncer. And these people were mostly women, body positive, sex
Yeah.
positive, feminists, right? And it's like, what? And I remember one time Georg just looking goes, you don't have to believe and accept this. It's not
No, exactly.
like,
Yeah.
questioning and you put it really well at the end of your book, and it's something that I've often talked about is like we have to figure out in many ways what do we want to adapt, what
Mm,
is in there that we can totally integrate, and what do we reject,
mhm.
you know. And I don't think a lot of people know a lot of practitioners in the West haven't really been exposed to the diversity and the depth. So how do we do that project if we don't have that? It's like John Coltrane learned his scales before he started playing outside.
Well, exactly. That's it. Otherwise, we can just make, bad crayon art and call it, Picasso. So I think, there's a lot of need for study, and, in yoga teacher training programs that have grown up and been systematized, as you've seen, in the time that you've been involved in the yoga world, they have become much more commoditized. And, there's an hours based criterion for what gets taught. There's no necessary independent verification of the quality of that information. And there's actually very little stipulation as to what is communicated beyond a few major texts. And
Mm,
those texts can easily get distilled into a very distorted representation of what's there. So people get themselves rubber stamped with, qualified, without necessarily actually really ever reading these things and getting to decide for themselves. Instead, they just sort of pull together these bits and pieces that sound nice. Yoga means union. You awaken to the divine within. It's all about chakras, and we get it all from Patanjali and all that stuff, from multiple different sources,
exactly.
and it
Yeah.
doesn't fit together properly. I mean, you can make it fit together if you invent a new philosophy, but any of those particular strands will, put that one piece of information that's been combined into a bigger picture together with completely different information. So, I think a good teacher training tries to show how that happens. And that's really been, I think, reinforced by the scholarship of recent years.
Yeah.
At the time when Georg was active, there really weren't many people who were prepared to stick their neck out as he was and say, I'm a practitioner, but I'm also, an academic here. Um, there were some who had, obviously dabbled deeply in practice, but they wanted to be more critical thinkers. So in some ways, they wouldn't actually really engage with the practitioner
Mm,
world. Whereas now there is an attempt to share some of the much more rich and nuanced understanding that's emerged from translating more texts, from bringing a lot of critical thinking skills to bear in relation to what yoga practitioners today have been saying about the history and philosophy of yoga,
Yeah.
and then also in just trying to effectively help people with some kind of handholds. But the problem is, obviously, the scholarly world is full of very clever people who write very dense books with lots of footnotes that a lot of yoga practitioners just don't want to read.
Mm.
And in a way, that's how I ended up writing my book. I borrowed from a lot of the research being done by the people who have broadened our understanding. And not to say that I want to deter anybody from reading that. In fact, what I try to say is, if you find my book interesting, then on you go. Read Roots of Yoga by Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton. Read some of the other anthologies of scholarly articles that have come out in the last decade or so. But people just don't really have any handholds, so they feel overwhelmed, and it's much easier to just stay in the bubble of what you've heard.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is more possibility now to get a broader yoga education than there was. It's a lot more accessible. The internet has obviously helped with that. The online study platforms, like I not to again blow my own trumpet, I teach a lot online these days, and I know you do as well. It's made things possible that weren't even a decade ago.
Truly, yeah.
So I
And I
think
think
there
you
is.
really, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was
Well, I
going
was
to
just
say, I
going to
think
say,
there's a lot
like,
of.
this is the service that you've rendered with your book, because I was truly amazed at how readable and accessible it is. I think it's a perfect place for people who want to know more than what asana, like yoga as asana, and
Yeah.
might not, it's like be at the place where they can dive in, like in the deep end of the pool and read, like the Roots of Yoga or even the Yoga
Mm.
Tradition by Georg or any of those books. This book really it fills a niche that I think a lot of us didn't even realize was necessary. But I'm reading, I was like, oh, I want every yoga teacher training to have this as, some in their curriculum in some way.
I would love it if that was the case. I mean,
Of
that's why
course.
I wrote it, obviously. Not from any kind of commercial point of view, I hasten to add. It was much more that when people asked me what book they should read, I didn't know what to suggest. So I felt
Mm,
I had to produce what I was teaching myself in a yoga teacher training context, so that when I was teaching elsewhere, I teach, for example, at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, and we have courses there on various yoga texts and on broader history of yoga and on yoga philosophy. People would always say, I want to go a bit further than just the general overview here. Where should I turn to? And I'd
mm,
give them academic material, and they just wouldn't get anywhere with it. So I had this sense that there was a gap that really needed to be filled.
yeah.
I'm far from alone in being able to fill that, and there's plenty of other people who are doing similar work. It's there's opportunity, as I was emphasizing, really now to draw on that information. And really, I guess the gift I had, I mean, the good fortune, my sort of karmic kind of contribution here was having come out of the world of the media, and I'd become disillusioned as a journalist. I didn't want to distill sound bites from politicians and rearrange them into stories to mislead people. Whereas I suddenly found myself, a long-term 20-year yoga correspondent, hoovering up all of this wisdom that's being unearthed by really intelligent and insightful scholars, and trying to put together edited highlights. This is the Wikipedia entry that is actually reliable. You can follow it all up. There's footnotes at the back. You want to read everything else, off you go. There's 50 pages of study notes you can dive into for the next 5 years. But the idea, though, was to keep all of that out of the main text, so that it's these bite-sized articles. They're sort of 500 words about each major theme that has influenced yoga over the last 2,500 plus years.
Yeah. But the skill, I think, was like each section is so short, and yet there's no sense of like surface watering down. I mean, you really go to it. And the other thing that has always been a major bone of contention for me is um, intellectual honesty. It's like
Mm.
when there's ambiguity, if there's a lack of knowledge about a certain thing, you just say we don't know. You don't try to fill it in and confabulate. And you had this one passage. It's funny. I know I wrote it down somewhere, where you said you're talking about, as we already touched on, how the basic worldview that comes out of the ancient Indian is that this sucks. Samsara sucks. And
Yeah.
moksha is ending reincarnation, ending this cycle of coming back and all that.
Mhm,
And it's very world denying. And
mhm,
we in the contemporary yoga world tend to be the opposite of that, right?
mhm,
And so you're like, perhaps the discrepancy, and here I would say, to be clear for people who haven't read your book, the discrepancy you're talking about is between Patanjali's worldview and project of renouncing and the contemporary project of embodiment,
mhm.
means that his philosophy needs updating, but claiming he says something different creates more confusion. And that has
Yeah.
always been my bête noire, is like people will say, Patanjali says fill in the blank, right? And it's like, no, he doesn't.
No,
That might be
exactly.
what we want him to say, but we should be clear about what he says. And then, as Georg said, and if we disagree, disagree.
Well, exactly. But the problem again we've got is, we want this sense of otherness and mystique and authenticity and
Mm,
authority to all combine in this yoga history and philosophy component of what we're interested in. And if most students aren't going to dive very deep into that, they really just want to find a few pegs to hang everything off. And we've been told that yoga comes from Patanjali. He's the father of yoga. He's the author of the root text of the Yoga Darshana, and sort of I guess scholarly classificatory terms in Indian tradition. Although even that is something we can unpack. It's not really the way that a lot of things would actually be seen by practitioners.
mm,
It was a classificatory process. So we've got this authority that's invested in that text that has absolutely nothing to do with what most people are engaged in a modern yoga practice. And yet there are some really helpful tools in there.
mhm,
And a lot of what it's talking about has basically been, I guess, cross-fertilized by other traditions, the Hindu, the Buddhist and Jain traditions particularly. And therefore, there's a lot of similarity and crossover. And as we talked about last time, it's possible, therefore, to, I guess, embody some of the spirit of what Patanjali's mind map is talking about through an application of the Buddha's teachings on mindfulness.
mhm.
But to claim that Patanjali teaches mindfulness is absolute nonsense. And that's the step that too many people are tempted to make, because they just don't know what to do when confronted with this cognitive dissonance. The simplest way of putting it is, I went to my Iyengar yoga teacher after a couple of years and said, where does all this come from? How do I find out more about it? And he said, I'll read the Yoga-Sutras. Where's all the postures? Get light on yoga. There's 200 pictures of this, burly Indian guy contorting himself, and this other book has just got all this weird gnomic stuff that I can't make sense of. It's clearly not related. And when I tried to get somebody to explain that to me, it took another 10 years before I got a coherent answer. And the eventual coherent answer is there is no link. We've just wanted to create one.
Yeah.
And teachers have tried to, join the two things together in ways that are really unhelpful. And this focus on the 8-part system, the Ashtanga yoga, with asana as the third of the 8 limbs, it's the most confusing thing anybody can be told, I think, at the beginning, because it gives you this strange sense that modern postural yoga practice, which is very recent, is actually very old. It also gives you the sense that it's sort of 3/8 of the way to getting enlightened, just to do some vinyasa. And also that, if you just sort of put that on the firm foundation of basically being a nice person, then everything's wonderful. What else is there to do? And in fact, some, like Iyengar, almost said you can get everywhere else through asana. So you don't need to bother with all the rest. So it basically validates postural yoga and says, it's a good thing. And I have no desire to suggest that postural yoga is not a good thing. I've got a lot of benefit from practicing it over the years, but at the same time, it's not what these texts were talking about. And
Mhm,
and that's confronting for people to hear. It leaves, a big vacuum, and that hole needs to get filled somehow. And what a lot of scholarship tends to do is, they like to talk about problematizing. So they rip the lid off it, say, well, what's in there is not what you think, and then leave you to go, rather than a bit of hand holding about, okay, well, what we now need to do is to do this process of sifting, as you were describing, trying to figure out what speaks to us, what doesn't, and what are we going to do with that. And
mhm,
I think really at the end of every teacher training, this is the assignment I set people. They don't graduate unless they write me a short essay on this topic. We should be able to say, why do we call what we do yoga? And
Mm.
how does that relate to what other people have called yoga in the past? And you can even just find one reason if that's all that you can find, but it has to be something you can articulate. Otherwise, we're just parroting. And there's just no service to anybody in pretending that things say things that we've not really thought through just for the sake of sounding more authentic. It's
Yeah.
much more, as you say, beneficial to admit, I don't know. I haven't really got much to stand on, but I do know this. I do know that, I guess paying attention to my breathing helps to steady my mind. And actually, people have been saying that for quite a long time. Yeah, that's a firm place to stand. Better to talk about that than the 8 limbs, which don't really lead anybody anywhere apart from to confusion.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially since, Georg would often point out that there's two models of yoga in the Yoga Sutra anyway.
Mhm.
There's the Kriya Yoga, and some scholars have suggested that the whole part about the 8 limbs was a later interpolation. I mean, who knows? But
Yeah.
there's the Kriya Yoga, and then there's Ashtanga Yoga, and they're both in the Yoga Sutra, and
And
it's
what's in Kriya Yoga is repeated in Ashtanga Yoga,
yeah.
so it's the same 3 things as 3 of the niyamas.
Mm.
So it's a strange kind of overlap in that sense, and
Yeah.
it is confusing. The thing that's said though, and this is where I think we get really lost in the modern yoga world, because we don't read these ancient Indian texts in the way that Indian scholars would in a commentarial kind of history of interpretation. So there are other texts that unpack what's in these pithy little statements, and there's even a suggestion that the earliest commentary, the earliest sort of footnotes on those aphorisms was written by the same author as the
Yeah.
sutras themselves. Whether
Yeah.
that's true or not, again, we will never really know. But there's a fairly convincing case being made for it, and not everybody's persuaded. Nonetheless, all subsequent commentaries refer back to that. So we can think of those first footnotes as pretty much integral to what the text means. And when we start reading them, there's no confusion about a lot of things.
Yeah.
But they're not translated. And for the last 150 years, the text has been cut loose of its traditional moorings.
Mm-hmm.
But the Kriya Yoga is introduced very clearly in the commentary. It says, basically, if you can't concentrate and you can't do all this funky meditation stuff, this is going to help you.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's a bit of discipline to do with the body, basically tapas, something that's a little bit of discipline to do with the mind, the recitation or study of sacred texts that will help you see your way out of your confusion. And then something that's basically spiritual, Ishvara Pranidhana, the basically letting go of self-centered worldview,
Right.
where it's all about me and what I do. It's somehow renouncing, and it even compares it in the commentary to the karma yoga of the Bhagavad Gita, renouncing the fruits of your actions to the supreme being. That's one way to interpret it. So it is the yoga of action. It is elementary starting point. And modern postural yoga can actually be organized a lot more coherently around those 3 principles. So saying, the tapas is the asana practice.
Mm-hmm.
The svadhyaya is what we're doing now, trying to think, well, why are we even bothering with this asana practice? Wouldn't it be better to go to the gym? And then the Ishvara Pranidhana is, the real point of yoga, which is to stop being so self-centered.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's not emphasized. Instead, it's all about self-care, self-this, self-improvement. The self is actually strengthened, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
egomaniacs running around claiming to teach yoga, which is a contradiction in terms.
Yeah, one of my podcast episodes is titled "Neoliberal Buddhism" because it's affected, contemporary Buddhism as well. A very leading Buddhist teacher was offering a course on the Noble Eightfold Path, and in talking about the precepts, which is the sila training, they are completely described as like, if you practice the ethical trainings, you'll feel good about yourself. It's like, yeah, and these are relational practices. They're telling us how to engage with the world, and you're not even mentioning that.
It's weird because that's a way in which actually the sort of the yoga worldview has influenced the Buddhist world.
Mm.
I mean, surely if there's one foundational principle you'd expect a learned Buddhist practitioner to have grokked by now, it would be not self. And in the yoga world, it's all about the self. So it's very easy for that confusion to creep in, even though it's always, the true self, the self with a capital S.
Yeah.
Very easy to slippery slope yourself into thinking it's all about me and aren't I wonderful, especially when you get into that non-dual stuff with all the tantric kind of loveliness of find God in yourself. In fact, you are God. You don't have to do anything other than awaken to that wonder. Of course, it's more subtle than that, but it's very easily confused for something as
Mhm.
simple as that. So little wonder that people go around acting, really indefensibly and claiming to be enlightened. And
Yeah.
Georg, he encountered all of that. If I remember rightly, he spent some time with a real wacko by the name of Franklin Jones, who went by all manner
Mhm.
of other monikers, and he wrote a book, Holy Madness, in which he really struggled to be critical of this guy, despite him being, to my mind, pretty beyond the pale. But
Yeah.
I never met him. I just heard a lot of stories, and so it's very tempting, I think, to believe that sort of hype that we can tell ourselves about where we get through practice. It's much healthier to not allow that to happen by just remembering the whole point here is to be diminishing self-centeredness, and any attempt to sort of self-aggrandize is just leading us in the wrong direction, or
Mhm.
even to make ourselves more comfortable. We should get comfortable with discomfort. That's the whole
Yeah.
point.
Yes. Yeah. It's funny because one of the principles, now that you just said that, reminds me that Georg comes up with, is that it's, opposite the idea that we're special, or yoga is to make us special. It's actually to make us ordinary, like to kind of like,
Yes.
and he said that's really the overall thrust of it, and the very, like, I actually, when I taught a course on the precepts, 9-month course. And in the
Mm.
first month, I tried to like say, all right, are you taking this course as an act of self-improvement, you know, or is there something else? Because it's not about that, and what is it if it's not a self-improvement, I always joke, it's like, like the non-self
Mm.
books, like instead of a self-help book.
Yes, exactly. And it's, I mean, it's really hard. I'm constantly tripped up by this delusion myself. I don't wish to imply that I've, somehow transcended the struggle that most of us are caught up in. I'm just trying to remind myself of where I'm supposed to go with it, because otherwise it's very easy to just get lost in this desperate attempt to better myself. And the bettering is actually to abandon all of that and to see, a little bit more clearly about what does need attending to. And as you say, how I am in relation to others, in relation to this idea of myself, and in relation to the world really does matter. But
Yeah,
it's not about improvement and about
exactly.
making it
Yeah.
all peachy. It's just seeing what it is.
Yeah, in the Satipatthana, the Buddha talks, when he talks about mindfulness, and this is one of, again, this area where in contemporary mindfulness it's become very much about, like, what am I feeling? What am I, me.
Mm.
I in the neoliberal podcast I put a link to, I think it was Google or some high tech company was doing something in the Bay Area, which their presence has led to huge problems with homelessness because of the rent going
Yeah.
up and all that. And so some activists took to the stage, and
Mhm.
after a while they were taken off. And the very first response of the leader was like, "Tune into how you're feeling in your body," which is good. But he didn't take it to the next thing, because in the Satipatthana is like, how might they have been feeling, the protesters? And that wasn't even thought about. But in the Satipatthana, it's like aware of whether it's the body or the mind, internally, externally. And then when he says
Mhm.
both internally and externally, he's talking about a relational thing, dropping out of the personal and looking at that. And that's completely glossed over in the contemporary mindfulness movement.
That's a really good example. I remember, I think Ron Purser cited that episode in his book "McMindfulness,"
Yeah, I think he did. Yeah.
and it was really jarring. You can go and look for it on YouTube. It was exactly that sense of people coming together, having a self-congratulatory forum, talking about mindfulness and so on.
Wisdom
When
2.0.
There you go. A bunch of protesters come in to make a really sort of uncomfortable point about predatory capitalism and everybody else being kind of disenfranchised from the area in which they grew up, and at the same time not being able to just listen, to just need to get rid of it, to control the space, to control the environment. It's exactly that idea. I need to get more comfortable. That's wisdom 2.0. That's avidya 2.0. It's how to get more reinforced in my own confusion.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not nice to have your space disrupted. And of course, it's not to suggest that the only way to be wise is to have no boundaries. But there is a way to be skillful in trying to speak up to these people, and then at the same time listen to them. And perhaps let them feel heard, and then say, of course, we've got a conference here which we're going to carry on with now.
Hmm.
And that would be modeling something a lot wiser. Whereas, as you say, it just reeked of, the need to stand above, look down, feel like we're all in our little sort of bubble. It's like the character in Silicon Valley, that HBO satire on the whole thing, who's the sort of pseudo spiritual advisor, I think, satirizing the mindfulness guru who worked inside Google for a
Yeah.
while, sort of telling everybody it's okay, it's like the aphorisms of New Thought going way back when, 100 plus years ago, about telling yourself in front of the mirror, every day in every way you're getting better and better. That's not yoga, that's not mindfulness, that's what now gets called manifesting. It's just, and all that gets jumbled up with yoga, and it's very hard to tell people the difference, because
Mm,
we're all marinated in it. That is part of the modern yoga scene.
yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
leading in the opposite direction.
It's interesting. I mean, I didn't even think to go into this direction, but using this as an example, just today, before we got on here, I noticed I subscribed to your little newsletter thing, right?
Mm,
And about the yoga of discord.
mm,
And one of my favorite examples of when I do teachings on the relationship between, let's say, classical yoga and the modern and Buddhist yoga, and the take on the immeasurables, i.e., the four Brahma Viharas, you know,
yeah.
um, and the world renouncing view. I mean, it's in the commentaries like Satchitananda and Iyengar. It's like each of those immeasurables. Friendly. I translate Maitreya metta as friendliness because it's related to the
Mhm.
root word for friend, and I think loving kindness sounds a little airy and abstract, but like we
Mm,
all hopefully have friends. So if we think about how we feel about friends, we can get more access to what we mean by metta or maitri, compassion, mudita, and upeksha, right? Joy, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And Satchidananda says each one is a key for a specific category of person. And they translate, as far as I can see, I've got at least 4 or 5 translations from yogis who are from within the classical yoga or Hindu yoga, Hindu culture.
yes.
And
Mhm.
they translate upeksha as indifference or disregard of the wicked, right? And in the Buddhist tradition, Chip Hartranft and Georg Feurstein both translate upeksha as equanimity. And Georg goes
Mm,
as far as saying people like Taimi, I'm not sure how I pronounce his name, is wrong to translate upeksha as indifference. It's balance, it's equanimity, and they're to be applied to all beings equally. And that really shows a difference in the project, and you were talking about like in the yoga discord. I mean, that even became more evolved by the time of the Mahayana, where the bodhisattva idea is like, yes, we are engaged in the world, right?
mm,
And karuna, which translates as compassion, the bija there, the seed is kur, to act. So it's not
mm.
just, oh, you're feeling bad, I feel bad for you. It's like, oh, what can I do? Right? It's a
Well, that's the
compassionate
key.
response.
Yeah, and that is the distinction. And so, if we actually do turn to the commentary, I'm reading here from the translation of Swami Hariharananda Aranya's full rendering of what was attributed to Vyasa traditionally, this first commentary on the Yoga Sutra, commenting on that sutra that you've just been talking about, 133, which is the one everybody reaches for when I try to tell them that it's the world renouncing text. And it says, very clearly that it's all about stilling the mind. Like everything in this text, it's all about, trying to
Mhm.
calm the mind. This is a tool to calm the mind. You can calm the mind by directing this feeling of friendliness towards people who are of a particular quality. So there's 4 things, the 4 Brahma Viharas. Then there's 4 types of people: the happy, the unhappy, those who behave well, and those who behave badly. And each is sort of identified in the commentary as going with one of those categories. And it's all about training the mind. So
Mhm.
the ultimate aim is to have a steady mind. So it's basically, don't get jealous of people who are, behaving well.
Right.
Don't sort of feel resentful of people who are happy. Don't have lots of Schadenfreude towards those who are suffering. Just you need to find a state of mind that does develop
Mhm.
steady-mindedness and equanimity, but entirely for the process of turning further inwards, away
Exactly.
from the
Yeah.
world. It's not about turning towards the
Yeah.
world at all. It's not actually about doing any of this.
Yeah.
And the key that
Satchidananda goes
helps.
as far as saying,
Yeah.
like, you need to disregard the wicked because, otherwise you disturb your mind. I mean, that's it right
Exactly.
there,
That's and that's a very accurate and fair rendition of what the original commentary has said.
Hmm.
It basically says, here's the translation of it. This sort of thought gives rise to cleaner virtue, and thus the mind becomes pure. A purified mind, becoming one-pointed, eventually attains serenity. So not even thoughts of evildoers should disrupt you from your one-pointed focus on clear-mindedness. Um, so it's basically a tool to derail any intentionality towards action. That's
Hmm.
what those things are used for. Now, of course, in some ways, the early Buddhist traditions were also, related to renouncing, and these practices were in some ways, geared towards the liberation of the individual. And the Mahayana mixes it up a bit and turns
Yeah.
it more into a relational, social orientation. But as you rightly say, the number one difference is all of those things are supposed to be directed to all people in all places at all times.
Right.
It's again an understanding of the non-separation of anything, and actually the capacity really just to manifest these qualities as a training, as
Hmm.
a counteraction to the poisonous mental tendencies that lead us away from awakening. And that's just not explained in the same way in that part of the Yoga Sutra. But elsewhere, it is explained identically at the start of the second chapter. The whole point about Kriya Yoga is it will get rid of your kleshas. It will
Yeah.
stop you being greedy, full of hatred, and full of ignorance. So there is this quality of developing the opposites, but it's never properly explained. Whereas because Buddhism was much more socially oriented in its understanding, because there's nowhere to go apart from in the
Yeah.
interconnectedness of things, whereas the yoga world's always holding out this possibility of
Right.
just somehow disappearing. It means you have to constantly be thinking: Am I upgrading this interaction to the direction of wisdom, or am I downgrading it towards the direction of suffering?
Mm.
And that just isn't explained in the same way. So
Yeah.
I think this whole text is oriented towards leaving the world behind, and it's very difficult, therefore, to just read it and map it onto modern life. We immediately have to repackage it to make that work. And if you read it through that Buddhist perspective, that's a very helpful way to repackage it.
Yeah.
We just need to make sure we don't call it what Patanjali had to say.
Exactly. That's it. It's like, I blurbed Michael Stone's book, which I thought was really great, The Inner Tradition of Yoga. And
Mm,
when I wrote it, I was like, Michael Stone details a practical, pragmatic psychology of yoga that can provide all practitioners a way to engage with the deepest transformative possibilities that yoga can offer. And then I had this phrase: it might not be what Patanjali said, but it's certainly what we need now. And sadly,
yeah.
Michael took out that phrase, and that was always a bone of contention that I had with him. I mean, I was friends
Mm,
with him and all, but it was like, no, don't whitewash it. It's not what he's talking about. And something that you just said about the social thing, you know, yes, the Theravada in the early Buddhist tradition was, as any other Shramana movement, ultimately world renouncing.
mm,
But the Buddha did stipulate that the ordained Sangha had to be in relationship with the lay people, right? And his Eightfold Path has right livelihood, which is certainly not anything that we see in the Yoga Sutra. So even
no.
from the beginning, there was definitely more, as I think you put it, like a social consciousness.
And let's face it, the Brahminical tradition, which is really what's there in the Yoga Sutra, it's the borrowing of Shramana ideas by basically what we would now know as the Hindu priesthood. And they've got their own system of getting paid. They administer sacrifices, and people give them money for it and feed them. And the Buddha didn't have that same opportunity. He was a mendicant, and therefore monks had to find income by providing services. So if we want to look at it transactionally and kind of very cynically and historically from the perspective of money and power, it would be impossible to have a sangha unless you're engaged in
Hmm.
generating some sort of support from benefactors by having these exchanges of teachings in return for sustenance. And that I think keeps things a bit healthier.
Yeah.
Whereas this other world, I mean, if you really want to go for it, you don't need anything. You go to the forest and you live on berries and leaves. But that's not what certainly anyone today is going to do, and certainly probably what most of the people who use the Yoga Sutra
Hmm.
over its history were doing. We don't really know who they were, but this commentary does address Brahmins several times. So it was probably written as a training manual that could be dipped into at a certain phase of life in priestly training. Give yourself a taste of world renunciation while you're a celibate student, and then off you go back into the world, and you got your right livelihood. Be a priest. People will give you things, and that's how it works. So it's different.
So one of the things that I like to ask, given all this, and it's funny because usually we go into the origin story, but typically, I mean, I love just getting right into it with you. But at some point, towards the end, I would like to, share a little bit about what brought you to practice and all that. But
Sure.
this big word Dharma. My podcast is called Dharma Lounge, and
Yeah.
I like to ask. Not that I have many conversations. I hope to have more. What for you, given all this diversity, like what is your personal approach to Dharma? Like, what does it mean for you, and how does it shape what you do? I know it's a big kind of world question, but
I mean, it might sound like a cop-out, but I think the honest answer is to try to ask that question. How does it shape what I do? Dharma is trying to do the right thing, really. And there are many ways in which that can be defined. It can be books of rules. It can be, socially ordained responsibilities. Those are two traditional meanings, certainly in the Hindu side of things. But it really comes down to right action. And it can therefore mean, the pure path of virtue. What are the highest, qualities to which we should aspire and seek to cultivate within ourselves? But it's also, how does that hit, the rubber of that hit the road of the messy reality of social interaction. So as I was writing about in that post about disagreement, the two sort of foundational principles on which most yoga systems of ethics are built are telling the truth and not causing harm. But those two things are completely in conflict with each other, because most of the time to speak the truth will upset some people. And if you go around only concerned with not upsetting people, it'd be very hard to tell the truth. So I saw this as a journalist. That was part of the reason I got so disillusioned, is the compromises made in the name of that without being honest about it. But at the same time, we have to find some way of working with that, and it's therefore context specific. So trying to prioritize both things will mean in some situations a little bit more weight being given to truthfulness, in others to not causing harm. And I quoted Thich Nhat Hanh, who said very eloquently, tell the truth, but not to punish. So you have to have this aspiration to try to at all times speak words of clarity that are not motivated by hurting other people. It's only just to clarify what is. So that's sort of one way of weighing up these these sort of opposite priorities, really, of virtue and reality in some ways, because reality is not very virtuous a lot of the time. But I think the other is to think about what's required in any given situation. And sometimes, I mean, the Mahabharata, where a lot of this stuff is discussed, it's basically a text all about Dharma. And the story is basically the good guys win by cheating. And that's all okay because they were upholding justice. So sometimes, the rules need to get bent. But as soon as you have this kind of doctrine of it's okay to bend the rules if you're the good guys, you validate all manner of misbehavior by people who want to wage war and tell you it's for a good reason. So it's impossible actually to put this stuff into words. That's why I come back to where I started. It has to be a question. How am I trying to relate to what I do in order to stop deceiving myself and deceiving other people through my actions? And so I think it's the fundamental question for a yogi who lives in the world. And it's actually the word that I think needs a lot more attention in the modern Western yoga scene, because that's what we need to be guided by. And none of these yoga texts really talk about it. In fact, there's a line in the commentary on the Yoga Sutra that's dredged up, the translation of it in Roots of Yoga, which translates the commentarial passages on the yamas and niyamas, and it's one of my favorite places to point to people for a bit of a reminder, a bit of a rude awakening. And it talks about how a yogi who's struggling to basically be good needs to perhaps undertake some corrective measures, and this is where one of the sort of emphasis is on cultivating the opposite tendency is made. Is if you're struggling to tell the truth or to not cause harm, try to cultivate the exact opposite of the harming tendency, and a lot of that can be helpful. But it also says you should first remind yourself, where is it? I have taken, where are we? Yes, I have taken refuge in the yoga dharma, the way of yoga, it's translated, but the whole concept of this yoga tradition, in order to offer protection to all living beings. But the way in which the yogi in Patanjali's concept would protect all living beings is to remove this one source of harm from the world, situated in a cave, and bliss out in the knowledge that you're no longer a problem. But out there's all sorts of other people causing all sorts of problems that are not your concern. There is a discussion in a way about how what you do can cause harm through what you support. But if you've actually left the world behind, you've kind of stopped caring about that. So it's a bit complicated. And I think if we were to think more about Dharma, we'd immediately have to think about worldliness. And the Bhagavad Gita is therefore a much more relevant text.
Yes,
because it's all about that. But then it's got its own problems. It's all about war, and it's got a supreme,
and its own internal contradictions. But it is offering an engaged kind of approach. One of the things that we talk about in the precept study course is, the first precept, just like the first yama, is in Zen, there's a pro and a con side to each of the precepts. So it's like the vow to avoid causing harm and then cultivate reverence for life, right? So, and like, for instance, yes, don't take anything that's not freely given. Don't steal, right? Is the second precept. Cultivate generosity. So there's both sides to each of the precept. But I often point out, notice none of the precepts tell us anything about any specific act or behavior. So when you take the precept, avoid harm, cultivate reverence for life, as soon as you begin to think, well, how do I do that? The precept's doing its work. Right?
Exactly.
Because the precept doesn't tell us how to act. It tells us, and this is why sila actually means like training. It's a mindfulness training to take the precepts.
100%. And yoga is an inquiry. It's not a dogmatic system. It's expressly based on direct experience. There's these pramanas in the sort of Hindu knowledge tradition of trying to figure out why you should draw your inspiration from a particular source. And the number one source for a yoga practitioner is what arises in the field of experience, and that's a trial and error process. Sure, you can logically infer things, sure, you need to find a wise teacher or read the right text, but in the end, it's how it applies to where you are right now. And for all of that, you need a roadmap. And if the roadmap is basically how to turn the lights off, then all you're going to be guided by is the ways in which you can remove yourself from all of these problematic situations. And to a certain extent, there is some wisdom in that, because we can't fix all the world's problems. So going around, as I used to, as a former journalist who was radicalized by my ex-employer, the New York Times, promoting the invasion of Iraq, I wanted to rant about the media. I wrote irate letters to journalists telling them that I saw through their misleading representations of things. I printed a fake newspaper at one point, the fake Financial Times, handed it out in London as an anti-capitalist, all this stuff. But I just got more and more angry and felt more and more impotent, and had this megalomaniac sense that I was supposed to somehow come up with the solution to all the world's problems. And that was actually causing me harm, and spreading a little bit of harm as well, because I was just an angry and unhelpful person when it came to politics and relating to the world. It would be a lot kinder to rein in the field of activity to something that's more manageable, like how I am with my friends and my family, and work on that for a bit. And sure, have an opinion, vote maybe, but even that I don't know about sometimes.
Well, building on your simile of like a light switch, Patanjali's like, turn it off. What we might need is a dimmer switch.
A dimmer switch is a very good way of looking at it. I think turning down the volume on all this stuff that
Yeah.
just gets in the way so that we can actually focus on what matters, but also, still having the possibility to
To
turn
go
up the
back up
volume
when
now and
it's
then,
needed. Yeah.
when it's important. Now and again, there's really important things out there. I mean, in this country, we're living with the consequences of that. We
Mm,
chose to leave the European Union, shot ourselves in the foot, and even a lot of the people who voted to do that are now not so sure it was a great idea. A
mm,
little bit more, wisdom in the public debate around it might have said, well, okay, politics stinks. All these people who run the world, have got their own vested interests, but we're probably going to be less worse off if we stay in this big club than if we leave it. I mean, that's a matter of political opinion. It's possible to disagree with that, but at the same time, I do think that a lot of people didn't give it much thought, and that was
yeah.
one of those moments where it actually mattered that we didn't give it much thought, and now we're stuck with the consequences.
Exactly. Yeah. And that we see, I mean, boy, talking about discord in your thing today, I mean, there's so much of that now. And like when the attachment to an ideology, and I'm one of those people that you can't be free of ideology. I don't use ideology as a negative,
Mm.
but if you're so attached to any particular ideology that you refuse to look at any um, contradicting evidence, then obviously you're going to fall into some major dukkha.
Well, exactly, yeah, and there's so much of that around these days. I see you post on these topics, and
Yeah.
so some of the authoritarian thinking that passes for progressivism is quite disturbing.
It's very sad.
Partly
Yeah.
because of people's inability to see it for what it is.
Hmm.
It's okay to hold an opinion strongly. It might not be the most skillful thing to do, but to at least be able to discuss that and to be open to looking at things differently.
Right.
That then you might learn. But
Yeah. I mean, I would say
otherwise,
what's happening, with what's I forget her first name, but that Professor Stock who got fired, and like
oh,
this whole this
Kathleen
stuff
Stock,
going on
yeah.
recently. I was like,
Well, she actually resigned, but she basically didn't have any choice. Yeah.
yeah, but like for questioning, just questioning, it's been so often talked about, like if you think it's a bad idea, then come back with a good idea. Don't just try to like silence people, because
Mm.
that's what that ultimately leads to even further and further division. We could learn from each other.
Well, indeed, and she's written a very eloquent book, which most of the people who don't like her don't read,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
so there's no conversation possible. She's just deemed to have sinned by discussing what she discusses, and so that's where the conversation ends, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And that's not a conversation, and
Yeah.
that's just how it is.
Well, before, when you talked about the speech precept or the yama, and you did mention motivation, right? I mean, you could, if the motivation to harm, then even though it's the truth, that's where it becomes problematic. There is a
Mm.
difference, at least from the Buddhist understanding as I have come to it, is there is a difference between uh, hurt and harm. I mean, sometimes the
Mm.
truth hurts,
Yes.
right? But maybe we need that as well.
Mm.
Harm is definitely something different, and um, and then sometimes to lie is a way of avoiding harm. I remember years ago, I can't believe I
Mm.
forget who wrote it, but some Zen teacher wrote this essay called "Right Lying," you know, and um, and it really wasn't that he lied so much, but it was a kind of funny situation where he was asked as a Buddhist priest to attend to I think it was a Chinese or Korean woman who was perhaps dying at a hospital, right? And he goes in there and starts doing some Buddhist kind of thing, and he's doing this. And then afterwards, one of the other, because most of the family were Buddhist, right? But one of the family friends comes over to him and says, she's actually Christian. And at that point, he sees that she's got a crucifix, and he starts doing like some Christian prayers and stuff like that. He's like, I'm not a Catholic, I'm a Buddhist, but like I just did that. But the typical example often is used, and this is where I always talk about, like in many ways, at least the Zen understanding um, around the precepts is that there's an absolute level, there's a relative level, and then there's the compassionate way that we should be, right? So for
Hmm.
instance, in the idea of harm, not causing harm, well, if you did that literally, right, just that's the way it is, then you end up having to do what Mahavira did, because when you boil water to make tea, you're taking life, right?
Well,
But then
exactly.
what
Yeah.
happens? Then you die. So you're breaking the precept one way or the other. The absolute level, if there's no self, there's nothing born, nothing dies, right? Kind of like what Krishna is telling Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. So to even think of killing or causing harm breaks the spirit of the precept, because there's nothing to, right? And so you've got those two poles. And as Aiken Roshi wrote, he goes, it's true that there's no one killed, but there's blood, there's cries, right? And so the compassionate response is what we need to do, right? In the real world, which is a relative realm. And, so
Yeah.
when it comes to speech, whereas Kant would say, if you were in Nazi Germany and you were hiding a family in your attic and the Gestapo came and they asked you if you knew where any Jews were, according to Kant, you would have said yes, right? Deontology. Just yes, you never lie. And people would say, well, what they'll be taken away and killed. And he says, well, that's on them, but I have to speak the truth. But most Buddhists that I know would say, in that case, you would say, nope, no Jews here,
Well, that's where things get quite complicated in the sort of realm of modern discourse and the difficulty discussing a lot of volatile topics, because there are obviously malevolent actors out there who do have very sinister and harmful intent, and there is, among a lot of people, often a fear of saying things that could be interpreted as abetting those people, and therefore it's better not to say anything than to say something that might further that agenda. And that's the basis on which a lot of criticism is levied at people who write books like Kathleen Stocks.
Mm.
And that seems to me important to bear in mind as well, because harm is caused, but at the same time, harm is also caused by not telling the truth and by feeling unable to have a conversation about things. And at some point, it is also important to make space for that, because not everything is the life or death situation that people suggest that it is. That's something that's very difficult to balance. Again, you can't get a textbook definition of that. We all have to look in our hearts and try to figure out, as you say, the compassionate response. And sometimes it's to bite the tongue, and other times it's to speak up. And I think some acknowledgement of that is helpful sometimes. And at the moment, there's a little bit too much still of an emphasis on there are certain things that are acceptable to say and certain things that aren't. And if you choose to break that taboo, then you're basically one of them, the bad guys. The polarization of everybody into us and them. Whereas we're all people. There are some people out there who really aren't playing the game of trying to be people together. And okay, let's make sure we're not assisting in that process. But for a lot of
And
the
the
time,
sad thing
that's not what's happening.
the sad thing about that situation is that what I might refer to as the illiberal left, that side, the more they go that way, the more there's this flashback from the extreme right. It's like these horrible laws that are being passed in the country
Of course,
are not being passed based on science. It's I think in many cases it is bigotry, but it's in response to other side that ignores evidence and science as well. So it's like, come on,
Polarization tends to feed off another dimension of polarization, and all of that's amplified by the way that modern media are constructed around profiting off discord. So really the only thing we can do is to try not to contribute to that. So as I was saying, in a way, sometimes it is right to shut up, but if we just decide that the only thing to do is to not have an opinion, then we're not really participating in the process of trying to live in a wiser society. We're just sort of ceding control to who shouts the loudest, and that's never a good principle.
So you were a journalist. When you were a journalist, were you also a practicing yogi, or did that come later? Or?
It's a very interesting question. I've actually just been trying to write about this. I'm starting work on another book, and I thought I needed to put some of this in there. I became a reporter as a career in 1998. I worked for Reuters news agency. I was a trainee foreign correspondent. And before
Mm.
I began that traineeship, I went to India. And in the process, that was the first time I really engaged with yoga. I bought a copy of Light on Yoga. I went to a few classes. I went to some one-day meditation sessions at a place up in Dharamsala. I considered doing a 10-day Vipassana course, got the fear, and instead went off and got high. And I spent a lot of time getting very stoned with some of these weirder, dreadlocked sadhus one can find roaming around still in modern India, who I later learned are, pretty similar to some of these early renouncers.
Yeah.
And people called them yogis. I was fascinated. I then went back few years later, while I was a journalist, to the Kumbh Mela, this big gathering of Hindu renouncers in the tens of millions,
Wow.
and various other pilgrims who come along to see them, held, the biggest one every 12 years. I went to that in 2001.
Mm.
And that was the time when I really got fascinated by yoga philosophy. I had friends who I'd met through spending time in India, and then also talking to people I'd met there back in the UK, who were basically old hippies who'd been coming and going since the 60s, in some cases, some a little bit more recently. And some of them had actually been initiated into sadhu orders. And so I was just intrigued by this kind of fusion of Eastern and Western, and
Mm.
how that related to yoga. But I wasn't at that time, regularly practicing asana or regularly meditating. It was something that, I thought was interesting, but I had actually convinced myself that smoking premium Himalayan charas was the fast track, and that was somehow going to, get me enlightened. And I went down all sorts of wrong turnings, including organizing a music festival in the former Yugoslavia, which I thought was going to replicate the effects of the Kumbh Mela by being situated at the confluence of two rivers on an island in the middle of the River Danube called Big War Island. And it was going to bring peace, love, and understanding to all these people who'd been at war the previous decade. And of course, that didn't go as I intended, and instead led to me being robbed by local gangsters. And
Mm.
after that, I came back to the UK, having quit my job at the New York Times in a fit of pique and protest at the, pro-war shenanigans. I found myself unemployed, sitting around in the UK, smoking weed and wondering what to do with my life. And somebody said, "Yeah, you should try yoga." So in 2003, I took up a regular yoga asana practice. And since then, that's been my main way in, I suppose.
Mm.
I also did eventually find my way back to Vipassana Center and do a couple of 10-day Goenka style boot camps. And I've since, I guess, freestyled, really. I've been
Yeah.
involved in various yoga asana practice traditions, but I've always had a bit of a problem with dogma, and
Mm.
therefore have found it a bit more fruitful to branch out on my own. But sometimes, these days I miss having a teacher. So I'm
Mm.
getting more and more curious. A number of my friends who are fairly senior yoga teachers I've been turning to for advice and a bit of guidance, firstly in what to do with my increasingly aging and creaking body, and also how to ground myself a little better in some of the principles that it's easy to talk about and less easy to embody.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm slowly finding my way back towards study with teachers of practices rather than teachers of basically wisdom traditions. I've
Right.
mainly been focused on that in recent years.
But it was, I guess, you also did grad work in yoga. That
Yes,
was.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So over the course of this 20 years of being a practitioner regularly, I suppose, I spent a lot of time going backwards and forwards to India. After my journalism career was very short-lived. 2003, it all ended, and it kind of burnt all my bridges. Wrote a book all about it. If anyone wants to read that, A Rough Guide to the Dark Side. And then I was just basically living in the UK, trying to keep it together, stop smoking weed all day, and yoga helped me to do that. But I found I was just, making money to live in London for a reason that didn't make sense to me anymore.
Mm.
And it seemed to me it'd be a lot easier to practice yoga and read books if I was in India rather than in London. So I found a way to keep coming and going from India to study and do bits of work to fund my next trip for a few years. And eventually I just thought, all of this is leading towards getting more serious. So in 2014, I did a master's degree at SOAS in the University of London, where I had the good fortune to study with a lot of these leading authorities,
Yeah.
like Jim Mallinson. and Jason Birch and Mark Singleton. And from there became focused on teaching philosophy and history. I did teach asana classes in London. I did teach asana classes in this little village where I live in the middle of nowhere. But the pandemic kind of put paid to doing that in person, and I've taken a sort of 3-year sabbatical. But I've just launched a retreat, so I'm going to have to dust off my asana teaching skills for a few people this summer. That might get me back into it.
That sounds
But yeah,
fun.
for a while I was really focused, as I say, on learning about where everything came from, and really going deep with study. And I've made 3 or 4 attempts to make the grammar of Sanskrit stick in my head, and it keeps falling out because I don't do enough with it. So I've done an introductory Sanskrit course, and you're going through the entirety of Sanskrit grammar 3 times, and I'm sort of halfway through my 4th attempt because I don't translate text myself. I just dabble with making sense of other people's translations. So that became my focus, really, and in some ways it's a kind of practice. Studying, reading, writing, teaching. But, obviously I've maintained my other practices alongside that. It just seemed that there was a lot of people teaching that sort of thing already, and very few people doing what I was trying to do, which was to marry this, I guess, interest in communicating with, deep grounding in the knowledge that's firstly coming out of Indian tradition, but secondly coming out of Western scholarship that's looking at Indian tradition. And I think marrying those 2 things skillfully, we can learn a great deal. If we pit them against each other, then it all goes horribly wrong. And you can have Indians tell you that Western academics are neo-colonials and they don't know anything, and you can have Western academics tell you that Indian traditions just don't tell the truth. But there's richness in both.
Yeah, it's funny to hear you say it that way. It's like in the world of science, there's a whole category of people who are involved with science communication. Because, and I think in a way you're providing that same kind of role, right? That your book certainly does that. People. Like a lot of scientists may be really brilliant, but they don't know how to communicate it, and the lay public can't understand them. And so there's a group of, Carl Sagan was a great example, one of the first really good science communicators, but we have more and more now, and there's science podcasts and all that, because we need that bridge. And I think that's what you're providing in many ways.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly what gives me pleasure, in fact, is to be able to talk about things, and also to be in a group of people where we're all talking backwards and forwards, and to have a community of communication, a sangha, really, which is something that's not emphasized in most yoga studios, but I'm trying to suggest should be on the timetable everywhere. Like, let's come together and talk about yoga.
Yeah, it's but that also reminds me, I know that you are involved in yoga teacher trainings even online, and it turns out that you have been a guest teacher for a colleague of mine here in Tucson, Pam Rodstand.
Yes.
So she said to say hello.
Radiant spirit. Oh, hello. Yes. Oh, no. She had a lovely group, in fact, who were doing the sort of advanced training, and we got together for exactly that, basically a sangha. Ask me anything you like, but in the end, it was a back and forth about why do we do what we do, and what's it all for, and how do we relate any of it to this stuff that we find in these texts that was written at a different time for a different audience, often for different purposes, and yet is not that far removed from what we're trying to do. It's just never going to provide us the blueprints that we can follow to the letter. So it's cool. a rich conversation.
I totally appreciate this. I feel like, we've gone a little over an hour, and I don't want to go too long. Hopefully there'll be some more opportunities, but definitely, how would people find you? And as I said, I'll put some things in the episode description, but you can tell us where to find you and contact you or whatever.
Well, I need to do some tidying up of my online presence. I think I'm scattering things all over the place, but I have this podcast called Ancient Futures, which lives on Substack, but you can find it on any podcast platform. I also have a website, truthofyoga.com, where I teach online courses which go deep into each of the major texts that people like to talk about these days. So the Yoga-Sutra, the Bhagavad Gita, the Hatha Pradipika, and the early Upanishads, and really try to do exactly what we've been doing in this conversation. Look at what they say, look at what we want, and see how to make some kind of a connection between the two. And so those are available at truthofyoga.com. And you can also find me on social media, either via my name or via Truth of Yoga. I'm on Instagram and Facebook if you want to connect with me there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. It was a pleasure. And
Thank
stay
you,
there.
Frank
I'm
G.
just going to stop the recording and we'll end up. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Daniel Simpson as much as I did. I want to thank you again for any support by subscribing, rating, sharing, and through Dana. And I hope that I'll see you in the next Dharma Lounge.